Hi, my name is Marco Perez Alvarez. I'm the senior horticulturist here at Vizcaya Museum and Gardens. I'm standing here in our rose garden, which we just recently completed the full restoration of. Back in 1926, a hurricane came through and wiped out much of the garden, including the rose garden. And since then, there hasn't really been a full uh, reinstatement of roses into the garden. So now, as of just a few weeks ago, we have a little over 200 roses planted in the ground now. You can see around me that there are multiple beds of roses, and I'm just gonna go around today and just talk about what we did to bring the roses back, what the process was of uh, bring, uh, bringing the beds back to their original design, and then also a few routine maintenance tasks that I do for the roses as well. So back in 2019, we decided to do a trial of a few roses, and we started off with these beds over on this side. Um, we had a lot of roses that were donated to us by the Tropical Rose Society. So once we tried those out and we saw that they were performing relatively well, we decided to go ahead and go with our next step in the process and installing the next 8 beds, which are these inner 8 beds that go around the Sutri fountain. And that was in 2020. And then just a few months ago, we did the final installation of the final 8 beds, which are on the outer portions of the rose garden. The process of that was just scraping up all the grass that was just here originally, because this entire garden originally was, before I got here, was just grass and then the Sutri fountain. So we tore all the grass up, and then I went to the original blueprints of the plan of the garden, and that had all the measurements and everything. So I mapped it all out, flagged it, cut all the edging, put it in, and then our team came in and we laid down the sod around the bordered edge. Um, and then um, to prep the actual rose beds themselves in the center, we got compost from our compost supplier, Compost for Life, and we put about 2 inches of sow, or 2 inches thick of compost, laid it on top, just kind of spread it into the existing soil just to give the roses an extra boost for the growing season. And then once that was in, we planted the roses and then laid down a thick layer of pine bark mulch to add organic matter to the soil and also just to keep the weeds down. So I'm now going to talk about a little bit of the maintenance program that I've developed over the past few years. It's been more of a trial and error thing because growing up in Miami, you don't really grow or see roses that much. So this has been my first time uh, growing and experiencing the fun task of growing roses in South Florida. Um, so right around this time of year is when the roses down here in South Florida start to come back. They don't really go dormant down here, but they do go through a slower growing period during the summer months. It just gets too hot for them, so they drop a lot of their leaves. They don't bloom as much. So right around end of September, early October, you'll start to see new growth coming up. Like you'll see here, there's already a few blooms on this one here, as you can see on this bed as well. Um, so also around this time of year is when you start to, start to deadhead your roses. You'll start to prune them. Back when I first started growing the roses, I kind of went a little crazy with the pruning because I did some research and everyone was saying was to cut them back hard, and that really didn't end up working that well down here. I think it stresses them out a little bit too much. So this time around, I'm going a little lighter on the pruning and gonna focus more on removing any dead, diseased, or dying branches. Um, and then just mostly just to keep the overall shape of the rose. If you want to follow me over here, I can show you what I use to do some of the maintenance tasks here. Uh, so for most of the work that I do, I use my bypass pruners. I just have my Falcos here, just make sure that they're cleaned every once in a while, just to not spread any disease or anything like that. Make sure that they stay sharp. Uh, and the task that I do most of the time when it comes to pruning is deadheading. So in this case, I usually like to wait until the full flush is over. So once all these blooms here have died off like this, is when I usually like to deadhead, just so that they'll all flush back at the same time. But for um, for our demonstration, I can show you exactly what I would do to deadhead this particular rose. So this one has two flower buds coming out of it. So you wouldn't just prune each individual bud. What you would actually want to do is go down to where you see a 5 leaflet leaf set. So you see here, this leaf here has 5 little leaflets. And then you would want to prune where that leaflet is growing away from the center of the rose. The reason you would want to do that is because that is where the next branch is going to be coming out from, and you don't want any of the branches to intersect with each other. So I'll take my bypass pruners here and just cut it just a little bit above that node. And if you want, I can show you where exactly that um, next branch would be coming from. And if you see here, that there is a bud. It's a little bump right there. So that's where that new branch and that new growth will be coming from. So you would basically do that with this entire rose bush, and that also just keeps it down to its to a relatively good shape. And pruning it and deadheading it that way also reduces the amount of pruning that you'll have to do later in the year when you do have to cut it down. Um, so the next thing that I do, and I would usually do this at the end of October, um, but doing more research, it might actually end up being more towards December or January, and that would be to prune the roses back. And that would be just this year, I'm going to focus more on just removing any dead, diseased, or dying branches. So I can give you an example over at this one over here. Uh, we do have a few roses that just haven't performed well over the years. This one just seems to not be coming back that well, but just it's a good example to show any dead, diseased, or dying branches that I would be pruning off. So this branch right here looks like it's not going to be performing well at all. So I would just cut that back all the way down. Well, it seems to be having some new growth out of it. So for now, I'll cut it down to here just to see if that new growth comes out. But by the look of it, it doesn't look like it's going to come back with vigor. And that brings me to the point of a lot of these roses um, are just trial roses for us. We're just trying out what varieties have worked for us. Um, and most of the roses we have here are on their own roses. They're not on a rootstock. Most of the roses that are grown down here, they'll be on a Fortuniana rootstock because that rootstock is more resilient to nematodes and stuff like that. But we don't seem to have any issues, at least so far, with anything like that. So most of our roses are on their own roots. Um, so another thing that I do, obviously for maintenance, is just weeding the beds. I try to do that at least once a week, or we have volunteers come in every once in a while and help with that as well. Um, and then watering, of course. Uh, you'll hear that roses need a lot of babying, a lot of care. And what I've learned over the years is if you just treat them like a flowering bush, just any normal flowering bush, they'll respond really well uh, to you. So I've been watering them once a week. At first, I was scared to even wet the leaves even a little bit because I heard it would just cause chaos, cause fungus, and all these problems. But I've learned over the years that they actually like a good soaking. As long as you're doing it either right before the sun comes up or while the sun is out, so that the leaves have a chance to dry out and the water isn't just staying on those leaves for an extended period of time. Because then that's when you'll have problems like black spot and funguses such as that. Um, so as of now, since there are so many beds to take care of, I just have little ground sprinklers and I set them up in each bed and that waters them out. I used to hand water them each one, but it's time management wise, it's just it it's not worked out that way. So we are in the process of looking into getting an actual irrigation system in here. So hopefully we can get into that very soon. Um, so one of the issues that a lot of people deal with when they're working with roses is they'll get black spot. Um, and really, black spot is never going to actually kill your rose. It's more of an aesthetic thing. So you'll see, let me get a good example. This rose right here is pretty much infested with black spot. Um, what I try to do when I had time before, I would individually take off any diseased leaf and just make sure it didn't actually fall into the rose bed because then it can spread over time. But if you don't have time for that, or you just don't want to get your hands dirty or anything like that, you can always just use a copper-based fungicide. And if you do end up going that route, only spray the rose that is already infested. Don't do an overall sweep of your garden, because I've learned that using a fungicide will actually sometimes inhibit the growth of the roses, and they don't like it that much. It helps with the black spot, but it won't. I feel, as at least with what I've seen, they just don't respond well as much to it bloom wise. Um, so I was actually going to talk about pruning the roses. So, oh no, I talked about that over there already. Sorry about that. So I've also been in the process of figuring out a fertilizing regimen. Last year, I kind of just did zero fertilization on them just to see how they would respond. And they did bloom. A lot of them still did bloom. But we kind of just wanted to give them an extra oomph this year. So all the fertilizers that we'll be using this year are all going to be organically based. Down here in Miami-Dade County, we have a fertilizer ordinance where you're not allowed to use any nitrogen-based fertilizers between May 31st and October 31st. So beginning in November, I will start off by using Milorganite, which is an organic-based fertilizer, and just spread it around the roses. And then on a 3-week rotational basis, I'll use a seaweed-based fertilizer and just water the ground a little bit, water the leaves as well. And then midway through the season, maybe around December, January, I'll use an organic-based bloom boosting fertilizer. So I believe for now that covers most of the maintenance that I've dealt with over here. So if any of you have any questions for me, feel free to leave them in the comment section and I can answer them as we go.
Okay, so we got a question from Instagram. What roses smell the best?
What roses smell the best? So my particular favorite rose that smells really well, I mean, there are a lot of them that smell great, but this one right here, it's called Belinda's Dream. So that's this one right here. It has a very sweet and fragrant smell. I still haven't really figured out exactly like what type of rose smells the best. But from what I've seen, the ones that usually have a larger profile, like this one, have a really nice scent to them. But that isn't always the case, because then you have this one over here. This one's Louise Philippe right here, and you can see it's much smaller than that one, but it also has a very sweet and fragrant smell. Um, so there's that. And next question.
Will roses grow in clay soil?
I believe they will. Down here in South Florida, we have the opposite of clay soil. It's all straight sand. So we don't have to worry about overwatering because the water will just leach right through. But I believe that they do grow well in clay soils. What you really have to worry about is any water sitting in the soil. If it's a clay soil, I would assume that you would have to water it a little less because you want that water to, you know, drain out a little bit more. You don't want the water to start to rot out the roots. Um, and I believe that that's something that would be an issue up in, like, the Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina area. And I know up there that roses grow very well. So I'm assuming clay soil is perfectly fine for roses as long as it has a lot of good organic matter in it.
When do roses stop blooming or flowering?
Down here in South Florida, usually when the weather starts to get really hot, so I would say around end of May, beginning of June, you'll start to see that they'll stop blooming as much. They'll just slow down their growth a little bit. No new shoots will be coming up, and they'll just end up dropping a lot of their leaves. And they actually will end up taking up less water down here. So you may think, oh, it's hotter, I might have to water the roses a little bit more, and that really isn't the case. You can just keep watering it the same amount that you have been throughout the year. Um, Unless you're starting to see actual decline in the roses. If you're starting to see that the leaves that it does have are starting to wilt and stuff, you can start watering it. I mean, like many other plants, roses are going to show you when they're not happy. So use your best judgment.
Why are roses not fall? Give us one of the reasons why a rose might not be flowering.
One of the reasons why the plant might not be flowering is it might not be getting enough sun. Roses like a good amount of sunlight. Um, it does really well in morning sun, like a long day of morning sun and early afternoon sun. If it's too shady, it just won't bloom. If the soil doesn't have enough organic matter in it, if the soil doesn't have enough acidity to it, it won't bloom as well. So those are the two main reasons why you might not see any blooms on your rose.
What do you do after the flower dies?
So like I showed earlier, with deadheading, I can show you an example again. This one's the Belinda's Dream. So right around this time, I mean, you could see that the rose is already spent. The petals are falling off. So what you would want to do is cut it back to where there's a 5 leaflet leaf set. So right down here, or just where you think that the branch is thick enough to where it'll be able to, you know, hold on to a new shoot. And you also want to make sure that it is a leaflet that is facing away from the center of the shrub. So the center of the shrub is right over here. So you would want to prune it back to right where this leaflet is. And the new flower bud will start to grow out from this little bud right here. Next question.
Why do a rose leaves turn yellow?
So rose leaves usually turn yellow, probably from black spot, like I showed earlier in this particular rose over here. So it's a fungal disease. It won't actually kill your rose. It'll just, not make it look as nice. It'll eventually, all these leaves will just fall off on their own, which is why I just go ahead of it and try to just take off all of the diseased leaves so that it doesn't keep spreading it throughout other roses. So this particular rose, I will probably, since it's so leggy right now, I will probably end up cutting it back just to get it more invigorated and bring it back to a new growth. Right. Next question.
Can roses grow in pots?
Roses can grow in pots. You just have to make sure it doesn't get too pot bound. So if you're starting to notice that the pot isn't taking up water as quickly anymore, or like if you lift it out and you're seeing that the roots are starting to grow at the bottom of the holes of the pots, then that's time to pot that rose up into a larger sized pot. But as long as you treat it like you do as if it's in the ground, where you're fertilizing it, pruning it, deadheading it, then it should perform well in pots as well.
Are there roses that don't have thorns?
There are roses that do not have thorns. There is one particular rose over here that I'm thinking of. You just have to go. There is a good resource. It's called Help Me Find, and you basically will put in the rose variety that you are looking at, and it'll tell you all the specific parts of that rose. It'll tell you whether it's thornless, what color the roses are, what size it'll end up growing into, which are all really good things to know about ahead of time before you buy a rose, just because you already have a specific plan in mind of what you want that rose to be. So it's best to get a rose that will be more adaptable to the area that you will be planting it in. So I can show you the rose that is thornless. Unfortunately, it is the only rose in this garden right now that I cannot find the name for. But as you can see, there are no thorns on this rose at all. Once I figure out exactly what rose variety this is, I can always have that information back out to everyone. And also, unfortunately, this is also one of my favorite roses because it is honestly constantly blooming even during the summer months, and it does very well in this spot. So once I figure out the name of this one, or if any of you have an idea of what this variety is, please let us know.
Okay, so from Ohio, when is a good time of year to prune back for winter? Or, and how short should I take it?
So in my research, since down here we have zero frost at all, but I've done a little bit of research on northern climates. Best time to do it is go to your frost calendar. So figure out the day of your first frost and count back 6 weeks from then. So 6 weeks before your first frost of the year, it would be the best time to prune your roses. Actual size-wise, I don't know how far back you would have to prune your roses up north. I would personally just concentrate more on the dead, diseased, and dying branches, and then just cut it back to the size that you would want it to be at the next year. And also just don't cut it back more than a third of the branch. So let's say like if I cut back this rose, this is about half of the rose height right here. I would not cut back more than this height up here. Just because it won't come back as vigorously, or it'll just take a very long time, and that next growing season won't be as productive as you'd want it to be.
Are these roses all own roots, or are they any of them fertility budded or grafted?
Most of them are own root roses. I can show you a few that are on Fortuniana rootstocks. I personally haven't really seen a difference in the vigor of them. I've actually noticed that at least with the varieties we got, the ones on the Fortuniana rootstock seem to be getting a lot more black spot. I mean, that has nothing to do with the actual roots, but this is one of the examples that we have. It's called Fragrant Cloud, and this is one of the ones that is on a Fortuniana rootstock. It does have a really nice fragrant bloom, but as you can see, it does get a lot of black spots, some disease. But I believe that with some pruning, and actually since you're here already and this is a dead branch, I can show you right here. You would just cut it back. right there, and it already looks better just with that branch out of the way. So I'll just monitor this one as the growing season goes on, and we'll see how it does.
Okay, so we get a guy. Thank you so much, Margaret, for all the great information that you've shared. People have learned and shared. Um, will you ever start a garden club?
Would I ever start a garden club? If I have the time for it. I recently, my daughter was just born 5 months ago, so a lot of my time outside of work is spent on that. So maybe someday, if I have the time to do it, I would start a garden club. Right now, my focus outside of work is my family. Yeah. Uh, thank you so much for tuning in. And if any of you want to come to Vizcaya and volunteer for us, we have many opportunities every single Thursday from 9 to 12, and the first and third Saturday from 9 to 12 as well. You can sign up through Vizcaya.org, or you can also sign up through Hands on Miami. Thank you so much.